Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Axel Moller, Cultural Attaché and Director of Villa Albertine in Chicago. I am pleased to introduce the third episode of our online Midwest Museum Talk, a series of transatlantic conversations about French art and culture in major museums across the Midwest. You can watch our two previous episodes in replay on our YouTube channel. Today, we are delighted to focus on the exhibition Hector Guimard, Art Nouveau to Modernism, on view at the Driehaus Museum in Chicago until November 5th. The exhibition brings together furniture and design objects, including jewelry, metalwork, ceramics, drawings, and textiles from a collection worldwide. This is the first major American museum exhibition devoted to Guimard since the 70s. French architect and designer Hector Guimard, often referred to as the quintessential French Art Nouveau artist and architect, has left without any doubt a great legacy in Paris. His innovative architectural style has left its mark on people's minds, both his admirers and his detractors, who dismissed him as madman because of his distinctive style. As some of you know, the iconic metro entrances of Paris were designed by him to inaugurate the brand new metro in 1900. Without his work, the face of the capital would have been quite different. You've probably all seen one of these Parisian metro entrances on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, which for a moment makes you doubt you're in Chicago. Our guests today are Élise Dubreuil, Curator of Decorative Arts at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, Sarah Coffin and David Hanks, co-curator of the Guimard exhibition at the Richard Driehaus Museum, Elizabeth Cummings, Director of Public Engagement at the Driehaus Museum, will moderate this conversation exploring what is so emblematic about Guimard practice and what is his legacy. Thank you all for offering us the discussion in the context of the 5th Chicago Architecture Biennial, which invites us to explore all the treasures Chicago has to offer in this field, including the magnificent Driehaus Museum. For those who can, don't miss the symposium dedicated to Hector Guimard at the Alliance Française on October 21st. And I think there are still tickets available. David Hanks will first give you a brief introduction to the exhibition. Then Elizabeth Cumming will moderate a conversation between our three experts for about 30 minutes. The audience will have the opportunity to ask questions in writing during the whole conversation, and we will take then a few minutes to answer some of them. Thanks again to the Driehaus Museum for honoring the work of Hector Guimard in Chicago with this magnificent exhibition. I'd now like to give the floor to David Hanks, who has an extensive experience in the museum field, including curatorial position at the Art Institute of Chicago and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Recent exhibition projects include Louis Comfort Tiffany treasures from the Richard H. Driehaus collection, Partners in Design, Alfred H. Bard Jr. and Philip Johnson, and Hector Guimard, Art Nouveau to Modernism, which opened at the Cooper Hewitt Museum, Smithsonian Design Museum, New York in 2022. As curator for the Stewart Program for Modern Design and its International Design Collection, his recent focus has been on creating the Designed by Women website, developed in collaboration with the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. He co-curated the exhibition Hector Guimard at the Driehaus Museum and will tell you more about this magnificent show and inspire those who haven't yet seen it to do so. And now David should enter. Yes, and I'm.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. So
I will. Working.
It's working. So I will share my screen so that everyone can see the presentation. And here we are.
So
David.
I'm going to give you background very quickly about how the exhibition came about. And I wanted to mention the three publications that are relevant to this subject. The first is the wonderful exhibition organized by the Museum of Modern Art in 1970. They did this very slim catalog but it was very important. It was curated by Lanier Graham with a lot of contributions from the collector scholars Yves Plantin and Alain Blondel. What is also interesting about this exhibition is that a much more ambitious catalog was planned, and they didn't have the funds to do it. So only this very slim publication was produced. Then in 1992, d'Orsay organized the major exhibition on Hector Guimard, and also this catalog you see there in the central view, curated by Philippe Thiebaud. And of course, we depended on the MoMA catalog and the d'Orsay catalog for information, and also the MoMA archives had an enormous amount of research that went into the more ambitious catalog that they didn't succeed in publishing. And then the present catalog for the exhibition published by Yale, for the exhibition organized by the Cooper Hewitt and the Driehaus Museum. And again, we had two of the authors from the d'Orsay catalog, Philippe Thiebaud and Georges Vigne, who wrote the Yale catalog, and also some very additional original work, both by Isabelle Gournay on the area of the Atelier, where Guimard's work primarily was, and Sarah Coffin on the role of Madame Guimard and her donations, which she'll speak about later. And finally, Barry Bergdahl, who then was curator at the Museum of Modern Art on Guimard's work in prefabrication. So I wanted to also show you the two installation views at the Cooper Hewitt and the Driehaus Museum, which were quite different. The Cooper Hewitt, both museums were using upstairs bedrooms of their 19th century houses for the exhibition. At least in this view, beautiful view on the left of the Cooper Hewitt, designed by Wendy Joseph, you can see that the background of the house has disappeared, particularly in this room because the original woodwork is gone. But at the Driehaus Museum throughout, you have a dialogue between the works of art and the Guimard works on view. They look that gate's the same, but it looks quite different in these views. So I wanted to also then go to Le Cercle Guimard and acknowledge their enormous help in creating this exhibition, which took an exceeding long time because it was interrupted by a period of COVID. And in particular, Nicholas Orio from Le Cercle Guimard, who incidentally will be part of the symposium on October 21st, and his colleagues, Frédéric Descourtels and Olivier Pont. These scholars have delved so deeply into Guimard's work. They publish newsletters, they publish books, and they were able to answer all of our questions. They could tell us if we ran into any fakes. They could tell us where to borrow the best objects for the exhibition. And this was a period of years that they were helpful. And then the central view is here of the Hotel Mazarin, where in Atelier, where Le Cercle Guimard hopes to have a Guimard museum, and we're doing everything we can to try to make that happen too. So I wanted to briefly explain the organization of the exhibition now at the Driehaus Museum. The first theme introduces the Guimards. There's that wonderful quote from Adeline Guimard at the time of her marriage to Hector Guimard. Quote, we will have to make a work of art with our whole lives, close quote. So their artistic collaboration was really the focus of their married life, and it was reflected in particular with the house Hector Guimard designed on Rue Mozart, which was his dream home. Adeline Oppenheim Guimard was from a wealthy banking family in New York, and her father and she could supply the funds that Guimard needed to design everything, because it's quite costly to have furniture made and all of the interior view to help him achieve his total harmonious work of art. So the next theme is visionary architects. It really is looking at Guimard's architecture, focusing on Castel Béranger, probably his most important work, or one of the most, and Castel Henriette, which is my favorite, although sadly was demolished some years ago. But here in this section of the exhibition, we're able to show not only the exterior, but the interior examples of interior furnishings, decorative arts, to show how he was rejecting classicism that he had learned at the École and incorporating new forms based on nature and new materials. So that he was able to design the decorative arts to allow this harmonious, unified design to be achieved. Not unlike his contemporaries, even Franklin Wright in Chicago had the same goal at a later date. Then the third theme is Guimard as entrepreneur and his branding, which he called the Style Guimard. He was ahead of his time in his ability in marketing, and he produced exhibitions, publications, and even a set of postcards, which you see one on the right, to promote his work. This was one of the first times an architect, there were maybe a couple of other, used this means to promote their work. And then he used this term then throughout his life. He applied it to everything. And even Madame Guimard, when she was making her donations of the collection after Guimard's death, told the museum curators, don't forget to call it Le Style Guimard. So that was the branding, and she participated in this. And on the objects, on everything he did. And then the fourth theme is production. The decorative designs, furnishings, and so forth for the houses I just showed you were expensive to make, and for luxurious to have this custom-made furniture. It took a long time to do, such as his own house, which he spent a few years working on the interior. So, but he was also interested in industrial production with the goal of making his designs widely available. And he began, after the publicity that generated from Castel Béranger and all of the publicity, began to receive commissions from various manufacturers, including Sèvres for porcelain designs, the Milo company for perfume bottles for the 1900 exhibition, and especially his cast iron designs for the Dizier foundry, one of the most notable projects for mass production. And you see an example of the perfume bottle on the left and the Dizier cast iron on the right, and that beautiful, it's actually a bench bracket, one of two or three to hold up the bench. And it was so used on the cover of the d'Orsay catalog. It's such a beautiful image. And then the Loose Lumiere did a line of lighting as well. I'm trying to watch my time too. So let's go on to the last theme, which is Guimard for the people. And this begins with the metro, which the Art Nouveau style often associated with luxury, but this brought this style to a mass audience. It was finished in time for the Paris exhibition, and he built it in record time, creating these entrances, such as the one on the left, which is one of the open ones, which were standardized, prefabricated cast iron. So it's the same idea went into his designs for housing in the 1920s that Barry Bergdahl writes about in the catalog, Yale catalog, and the creation of the standardized building blocks that were easy to transport and assemble in low-cost housing, such as the example on the right. So this is a quick summary of the exhibition, and I like to turn over to my friends who will join us in further conversation.
Thank you so much, David, for your presentation. I'm Elizabeth Cummings, Director of Public Engagement here at the Driehaus Museum. I'm now going to join you in the capacity of moderator. I just want to recognize how wonderful it is to have people on all sides of the Atlantic Ocean here in this chat and also in the audience. I will move on to introducing our additional speakers. Sarah D. Coffin is an independent curator and consultant. She was the co-organizing curator with David Hanks of our exhibition, Hector Guimard from Art Nouveau to Modernism, and its related book that David mentioned. Sarah is the former senior curator and head of product design and decorative arts department at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, where she curated many blockbuster and award-winning exhibitions about design. And then moving on to Elise Dubreuil, is curator of the Art Nouveau Decorative Arts Department at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, where she's been since 2013. Her recent exhibitions at the Musée d'Orsay are Aubrey Beardsley, 1872 through 1898, which took place in 2020, and Les Origines du Monde, l'invention de la nature au 19e siècle, which happened in 2021. And she just closed a wonderful exhibition on Antonio Gaudi in 2022. How we are going to proceed forward is I will be asking our guests some questions, and I will leave the floor to them to answer them. So I will just be here sort of as a captain steering everyone through. And my first question for you all, my first discussion question is, Hector Guimard was one of the principal architects and designers of the Art Nouveau. So much so that he called the Art Nouveau le style Guimard. What makes him so important in your view, and how original was he? And then Sarah and Elise, I think I would like you to respond to this question, particularly to tell us about the French and American sides of the conversation.
Right. Well, from here from Paris, of course, you said it, David, in the presentation. In a sense, Guimard is everywhere because we have those remains of the metro station, who were designed by Guimard originally for the launch of this new way of moving into the city. So he is connected to the city and the idea of modernity, because of course, in 1900, the metro was still a very, still a new thing. But we also have to remember that there was a long time when Guimard was somehow forgotten in the French construction of modernity, and the whole Art Nouveau generation past World War I was gradually a little, we'll say, underestimated and forgotten, as opposed to the Art Deco style, and then to modernism as it developed in the mid 20th century. Maybe Sarah, you would add something about this fact.
Well, I certainly think that David's point has made the point that Art Nouveau essentially hardly existed in America, and really Americans' only appreciation of Guimard until the 1970 exhibition in MoMA, and even then it's a limited audience, is through the Metro. And obviously it's something that people can still see today. And even if you mention Hector Guimard's name, it is not something that everybody goes, oh yes. But if you say the one who designed the Metro, then they have it. But I would say that his style of operation is quite American. The idea of branding himself, the Style Guimard, and the idea of branding is something we definitely associate with modern American thinking about how to promote oneself, whether it's artistically or in business. In fact, I personally think that while it appeals to the American concept, it is in fact quite rooted in French tradition too, because after all, we have Meissonier, who published his book of his design, Rococo designs, in the 1730s and 40s in Paris, and became associated as really the inspirational start of Rococo design. And in fact, the first time I put some Hector Guimard objects in a exhibition, it was indeed in an exhibition about the idea of the free spirit of Rococo. And like the other Rococo objects of the 18th century, Hector Guimard really did aspire to quality. And what is hard for the American concept to gather is that somebody is making both luxury market objects and wants good design for the people and uses mass market techniques. And so it's the mass market technique of cast iron and the glass making and all these other methods that are not necessarily expensive, that go along at the same time as his expensive methods, that make him branded as Style Guimard. At the same time, he shot himself in the foot, because in fact, no one then, after World War I, recognized that he could possibly be so innovative technically as with his building blocks. David, did you have any further thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's interesting. In the United States, a lot of us grew up with the Museum of Modern Art, which was so influential, and they looked at Art Nouveau and they collected Hector Guimard's work to show the beginning of modern design. And the great masterpiece of furniture, his own desk, was on view at MoMA for decades as the masterpiece of Guimard's work. And I think that was influential on certainly people interested in design throughout at least the United States, who visited MoMA and always would go to the design department to look at this history of design. And there the beginnings were with Hector Guimard.
Right.
So talking more about this transatlantic relationship, was Guimard perceived differently in Europe than in the US, and why? Was he even known in the US at his time?
Well,
David,
yes, David might stop there
Well,
on the US point of view.
He was not known when he was working. There was that one article in Architectural Review that was published early 20th century on Art Nouveau. He was certainly not, despite the MoMA exhibition, the fact that exhibited Guimard was not a well-known architect in the United States, but is very different in Paris, where, as you point out, he's all around, his houses, his buildings, and the metro.
Yes, but also, like we briefly told just a few minutes ago, he was forgotten and underestimated in its own country and in its own city for years. And in the 50s, in the 60s, you had a lot of destruction of his work. David mentioned Castel Henriette, and I think, at least the three of us who dream of visiting Castel Henriette, but it was destroyed in the late 60s. So it was not especially Guimard, as the whole French Art Nouveau generation was somehow forgotten and a little despised at the time, but maybe very strongly Guimard, because he's it's what's interesting also into Art Nouveau. You have a global movement, but you have very strong personalities inside of it. And Guimard is indeed one of the strongest for the French Art Nouveau. And so maybe it's because his artistic personality was so strong that he was so much subject to caricatural visions, even in its own time. And afterwards, he was so much distracted and forgotten. And there is also the fact that Guimard actually had a long, not necessarily a very long life, but had a life after the Art Nouveau moment in France that closed almost with the beginning of World War I. So after that and during that, he still works, but he keeps on evolving and proposing new things, but people kept this very frozen vision of his art of the 1900s. And into our historiographical approach, it's only from the end of the 20th century that we can see the whole complexity of his entire career.
Well, there's also the fact that, I mean, by contrast, he comes to New York because his father-in-law has died in 1912, well before he actually moved to New York with his wife on the eve of World War II, because she was Jewish. And the fact is that when there's no publicity whatsoever that I could find in my researches, nor apparently have others, about his coming to New York, that might have been quite a note for somebody of his fame in 1912, that normally there would have been a lot of coverage by the local press of such an august person coming, and he certainly would have appreciated the budding architecture. But even though his style was very different. And I think also that that it was earlier than you know, his work, when it did get appreciated, it was after he'd really fallen out of popularity in Paris. And in fact, he came to America in 1938 as a refugee with his wife, and never returned because he died during World War II in New York. But what is important, I think, in looking at what he brought with him, or what his wife really arranged to have with him, were the prefabricated houses before Le Corbusier, and that sort of work. He must have felt that that would be the area in which he might, if he resumed work in America, he might get some renown there, because perhaps he wouldn't be so connected with Art Nouveau. It is hard to know, and the Americans' only experience at that point would be, as both you and David know far better than I, is his connection to surrealist artists and the first interest of Alfred Barr at MoMA, which I think both you and David have more addressed.
I think we should, maybe at the end, we can pull back some slides and dive a little bit into that question of the surrealist artist, because we did kind of create some images for everyone. Here we go. So I think about 2 slides later, Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so this was something that I learned when we started having conversations to plan this program. Elise brought up for me that Dali wrote specifically about Guimard's work.
Yeah, that's a way Guimard and the Art Nouveau generation kept a presence into the avant-garde scenes, it through surrealism and especially Dali's look. And so when I worked on Gaudi a few years ago to settle the exhibition and prepare the content, we have to think about this link that Dali constructs between Guimard and Gaudi, which is very interesting, which is very, it's really food for thought and a way to see both artists differently, although they never met, of course, and there is absolutely no material proof that they saw the work of each other. It's not impossible because photos would be circulating within Europe in reviews and that kind of thing, but we have no direct proof of that. But still, you can see how two very strong personalities work asking themselves maybe the same questions and coming up with different personal answers to those same questions, which are how to conceive modern architecture. And Dali, in his very weird view, felt that and wrote a very Dali-esque text as early as in the mid-30s, as you can see, with de la beauté terrifiante et comestible. That's very Dali. I should speak with his very special accent, but that was his style. But there is really an eye beyond that. That's interesting to show how Guimard was one of the artists that the surrealists and then the people involved in the psychedelic movement in the 70s would understand and feel close to. And they probably allow Guimard posterity to remain and to sew a fabric of interest for Guimard, whereas he was not that much in favor into official artistry for long.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to stay on this subject and go a little off script, if you will permit me. But Sarah, when we were preparing for this session, was describing very interesting contextual information about art movements in other European areas that were happening at the same time. And I think it frequently comes up that people want to know, were all of these artists talking to one another? So Sarah, tell us what you know about Christopher Dresser.
Well, Christopher Dresser, apart from being the subject of the first exhibition when I arrived at Cooper Hewitt, comes to mind very much. He was the first person really to work with industrial cast iron at Coalbrookdale, but look when he was doing it in the 1860s and 70s. But he created these unique designs as part of design reform. So he had a great sense of reform, but unlike William Morris, he also felt he wanted to use modern materials and modern methodology to make it more accessible on a broader level. He also had a very fanciful side, and you're looking at the Warbanda Brothers ornamental border design that was based on a design of 1867, but produced as a wall covering in 1883. his designs were also produced by Lincrusta Walton, and this was a company that that Guimard later used. And then I'm afraid our images may be over the slide of the Guimard piece, but there is a design for an entrance gate at the Hotel Yassadeh in 1893 from the Musée d'Orsay, and that is very similar to the dresser piece of 1870. So Guimard went on a fellowship to Britain as sort of after studenthood, and he went and around and met some of the other reform designers like Mackintosh, who was working. But there is such a strong link, and the fact that Dresser's work was being exhibited in Paris exhibitions from the late 1870s on, he certainly had access to seeing them, whether he met him or not. But I think the next slide, which is two contemporaneous wall coverings by Dresser and Guimard, indicates, but Dresser was also doing those, and the idea of using wall coverings and carpets and all sorts of things. So there's definitely, Dresser was very well known in an international environment, and he and Mackintosh had others. So if we can have the next slide, then I think you'll just, so I think in fact, the Dresser one is almost more Art Nouveau than this wallpaper for Gaston Béranger, but other Dresser wallpapers cover of earlier date of the 1880s, pre-Guimard's ventures in those fields were less so. So in any case, he is very connected through his trip. He went to Liberty's, he met some of the designers at Liberty, including Liberty himself. And I think this is an important fact. And I just wondered, Elise, this from an Anglo-American point of view is certainly a connection that we all see coming from the outside. But I wonder how in that there's sort of a Louis XV revival almost element of early Art Nouveau with Guimard, whether the Anglo side of this story is actually ever discussed in France.
Yes, on the same idea, we have to remember that Guimard went to Belgium, to Brussels, and that the meeting with the work of Victor Horta might have been a decisive, had a decisive impact on his own work and evolution, of course. And that's what's very dynamic when you study Art Nouveau as a movement in its globality, is to see how all those artists sometimes interfered directly, sometimes just maybe saw some pieces of work of each other, and how it feed their creativity.
I know that the Victor Horta references we frequently mention with respect to our exhibition here, but that was very illuminating to learn about the Christopher Dresser connections as well. Segueing to another sort of moving down the timeline here, I want to talk a little bit about Hector Guimard's legacy. When and where, and I think that this has already sort of been touched upon, when and where do you feel Art Nouveau has been popular in the 20th and 21st centuries? For example, David, you cited the MoMA Guimard exhibition in 1970. Do you feel that the Guimard exhibitions played a role in his legacy?
I would like to think museum exhibition had more influence, but maybe they do today with the new technology, but I don't see that in the past as being so influential. When you talk to the average American, they don't, or even a designer, they say, who's Hector Guimard? I mentioned the exhibition, and then I say, the metro. Do you know the metro? Oh, the metro. Oh, that's, yes, they recognize the metro. So that's the way that he's become known. Certainly I mean, Sarah, you've been working on his legacy in terms of donations from Madame Guimard after Hector Guimard's death. Maybe you want to comment on that, because that certainly was created his legacy in the museum field.
Well, he was well established as an architect by 1909 when he married Adeline Guimard, and in very short order managed to produce the designs for her wedding dress, her engagement ring, all sorts of things, as well as they are starting to build the house and so on, that it was to be a showroom and her residence. So the idea of her commitment, and it does seem to have been somehow, that we don't really know how they met exactly, but the wedding, that he certainly had she had a sort of dowry that was gifts from her father, but also from some investors who were friends of her father's who invested his. So this enabled him to produce a great deal more in the way of his designs, but some of them were in fact designs he created earlier and accessorized the house with. But she really stepped to the fore, and I think we had the slide on briefly, but we could go back to it, of her studio. She was an artist. She'd come to Paris to study art and to train as an artist. And she was a studio. She had a studio, there it is on the left, which if you look carefully, you can see, you may be able to see the nude up on the wall is actually enframed on the right wall of the bedroom at the Hotel Guimard, their house, but it's all done in an Art Nouveau surround. And yet I see absolutely nothing in that studio, even though there's some Renaissance revival chairs, nothing that would indicate the remotest interest in Art Nouveau. So what was very clear was that she somehow got to know him and or knew his work because he was so famous then. And apparently was decided that she wanted to be a patronne of the arts. So she indeed married him and gave them the possibility, but remained committed throughout her life. And when there's so many things came to America, she gave them to American museums, but more importantly, when she went back after the war and his death, she tried to give things to French museums, and she succeeded. And there are two rooms, one in the Lyon Museum, because that's where he was born, and the other in the Petit Palais. And so in many ways, she secured his legacy, but also by leaving a large amount of archives and drawings in the New York, with Cooper Hewitt and eventually the New York Public Library. And those are really the source, including of Plantin and Blondel's work. They came and worked in New York on much of this material. So her activities in getting these things to MoMA, to Cooper Hewitt, and so on, really enabled his legacy to survive.
And so also, I mean, of note is that in addition to that, 90-something piece collection at the Cooper Hewitt, Richard Driehaus was a significant collector of Hector Guimard's work as well, Art Nouveau in general, which is why this exhibition really is taking place here at the museum. Shifting a bit so now we've talked about the American side of this transatlantic legacy. Let's step back a little bit and talk about some of those names we heard about leading up to us. How did Hector Guimard's work sort of get rediscovered in France?
In France, it was, the whole late 19th century had to be rediscovered at the almost 100 years after it existed in the late 20th century. So, which is, I have the opportunity to work in a museum that was born after me. because we don't have to forget that Orsay opened in 1986 as a museum of the art of the 19th century. And that's a bit unusual, but before this creation of the 70s and 80s in France, the organization of the French National Collection didn't leave many room to Art Nouveau, which was never an official art in France and almost never officially collected by the French state until the end of the 20th century. So therefore, people in the late 60s and in the 70s really got interested into this moment of history of art and starting rediscovering things. And Sarah mentioned Plantin Blondel, who two men who really rediscovered a lot of Guimard's work. And our collection in Orsay inherited from their work, actually. And there were a few exhibitions in the Centre Pompidou, who was inaugurated in the mid-70s, so a little bit before Orsay, and also in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, Museum of Decorative Art, which is on the other bank of the Seine when you're in Orsay. And in the 70s and 80s, there were exhibitions dedicated to what we call the roots of the 20th century, or the pioneers of modernism. And Guimard took place in those, but it was not a monographical exhibition, of course. It was Guimard as a part of a generation of Art Nouveau in France. So it was the beginning of something, but only the beginning. And then it has to be constricted and becoming stronger. And we try to make him more room in the museum at the time, though it's not as easy as we could wish.
Thank you. Yeah. David frequently references very, very large design drawings that hang at the Orsay, which sounds pretty cool.
Yes, we have this incredible set of Guimard studio designs, when you can see his work on all scales. I mean, you can have a huge design for part of the building, but also a huge design for a chair or a piece of furniture. And it's really very, though there are very strong drawings when you can see how it thinks about the sculpture, so let's say the aesthetic effect, which is always very subtle, especially on his furniture, I think, but also on the technical aspects. How is it going to be possible? How is the carpenter going to join the wood pieces? So it is actually a chair, if it has to be a chair. And it's this this union between a truly aesthetic vision, even sometimes with those curves that you won't think rational, and the efficiency of what you're designing. That is really, really strong into Guimard's work, and is one of the issues of Art Nouveau in France, I think.
Thanks. So let us turn to some audience questions. Please do put your questions in the Q&A. We'll be happy to answer them. The first one we have is, why do you think it is in the period of the Art Nouveau style that architects started being involved in creating interior designs and designs of separate objects apart from constructing buildings itself? So it's this idea of unifying the interior and the exterior.
The question, when does it begin, or is it?
Well, the question says, why do you think it is in this period that exists? But I think we could also say that that's happening in parallel geographies and time periods.
And earlier
Right.
too.
Right.
Right.
I mean, you have Robert Adam in England in the 1780s. You have other styles, and of course, even Meissonier, I referred to earlier, doing entire interiors as well as silver and furniture and so forth. So it does exist, but this unbelievable down to the last detail of whether it's a cigarette box or a set of glasses, all designed, I think, is very much in the air. It's, after all, the primary word we use for it is Gesamtkunstwerk, a German word, and it was very prevalent in secessionist Austria with Joseph Hoffmann and Moser and so on. So I definitely, and certainly with Mackintosh in Britain, in Scotland, as well as England, and in fact, so much so that, again, I do think that concept, for both probably with Horta in Belgium as well as in Britain, is one that was very more popular even in Great Britain than it was in France in the 1890s when Guimard went to Britain and Belgium, but that in some ways there was a lot of British-Austrian interaction at that time. And I think in a way he was perhaps bringing that concept back to France. But why that's a very good question. Perhaps it's why it's happening with such incredible degree of completeness at that period. I don't know.
Mhm.
What do you think?
Yes, maybe it's also a moment when the home has a different meaning from the past centuries and decades. Maybe massively people's condition of living started to increase with innovations such as better water access, lighting, gas, electricity, gradually coming to more and more people. So more and more people can actually have a reflection about what is my home going to look like, rather than being in a survival quest for being able to be protected, just as simple as that. And so here we found again this paradoxical aspect of Art Nouveau, which addresses as well as working classes and trying to help them figure out what is a decent home, and also addressing to a very high level of society and conceiving incredible decor, incredible homes with a lot of materials, very expensive furniture and textiles and everything.
Mm-hmm. Sort of an auxiliary question about this. Someone noted that as the lecture sort of unfolded, the question about these different movements, Art Nouveau to Art Deco, the arts and crafts movement, begins to arise. I'm wondering if you can sort of elucidate a little bit further how they were related, and if so, and how do we distinguish each of them?
Sarah, that's for you.
Well, I think that I'm not the only answer. I think we could have three very different answers on this one, but essentially, I think we are looking for whiplash curves and a certain biomorphic forms, the idea of nature perhaps in its most elongated and curvilinear forms used as the basis of design. But I think it's in the Art Nouveau, whereas I think other details like the reduced grid work that Mackintosh and Hoffmann show in their Gesamtkunstwerk of the same period is more perhaps classically oriented. So I think there are different reactions in different countries and different places, but they all are trying to express a different visual expression of some movements that have taken place in the past. As one has talked about, the mid-18th century being a very organic, sensual Rococo design, you get this occurring in Art Nouveau. But the rectilinearity of some of the other styles, it really is in direct contrast. And yet there are designers who go from one to the other, or they make organic ceramics, but have their graphic work differently. So I think it's the idea that multiple styles can coexist, but they are trying to rationalize them after what we would call the Victorian period, but the mid-19th century industrial period, where people threw all sorts of styles together in a mishmash and didn't necessarily think about their relationship to each other. I think it's an attempt to quote unquote purify design down to certain elements, and each country may choose to do it in their own historical way.
They share the idea of reform.
Right.
Yeah.
You're reforming design.
Right, but exactly with what motifs can be very different.
Yeah, and
Yes.
that's, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that, of course, I always say that Art Nouveau is a movement and not a style in itself, because as Sarah really well explained, there are different stylistic approach that are co-living within the Art Nouveau movement. And as David said, the start of all that is a will for newness and for reaction against industrial forms that were not believed up to the level of the past centuries. So from that, there were different traditions in different countries, because the ecosystems were different. And in France, you have the idea that there is a shift, quite radical, between Art Nouveau and Art Deco after World War I. But in some other countries, the transition was smoother. Many times in countries where this geometrical approach was from the beginning, from the Nouveau period, it was easier then to drive the Modernism line.
Thank you for that. I was just going to say that as someone who works in the Driehaus Museum, we have many of these styles all combined into one. So it is particularly useful to return to that question every now and then. So that is going to be it for us. I am going to remind you, please do come see the exhibition, because there is so much more than what we talked about today on view, but also in this catalog. You can order it online if you'd like. And a very special invitation to come to our Forum of Ideas that we're having on October 21st about Hector Guimard, new research that he put out in collaboration with the Alliance Française du Chicago. So you are all very welcome to check that out on our website and look for more. And I will leave it with Excel to close us out.
Thank you very much for this fascinating conversation. Thank you. Thanks to the four of you. And I would like to thank the audience for the attention and the really interesting questions that have been asked. And I really hope, as you said, Elizabeth, that they will have the desire to see the exhibition and to dig more into what is Art Nouveau, Art Deco, because as you can see, it's a fascinating area of creation, and there are many things to understand about the French and American relationship around this movement. Thank you very much, and see you soon for another museum talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Excel.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.